Now that we're a little bit more comfortable with complex sketching entities like splines, let's talk about making some complex features. Now, when I talk about complex features, we're really just stepping out of the realm of just making an extrude or a revolve. Now, those are probably the most basic elements that you can create inside of a parametric CAD system. But if we move away from that, we have things like a sweep, a loft, and a boundary. Now, these are very intricate types of operations. You really need to know what you have going in. When you go into something like an extrude, you have a closed profile, and you can do a thin extrude or a solid extrude or whatever the case might be. But when you go into something like a sweep or a loft, you need to have all of your sketch entities figured out before you go into it. So let's take a look at this file called Complex Features, and let's see what we can do in the sweep, the loft, and the boundary boss. So first we'll start with sweep. Now, Sweep has two options. When you start, it has a sketch profile and it has a circular profile. Now, this is something that SOLIDWORKS recently added. It allows you to just select a path and use the circular profile option. For instance, if we select the path in the center of this, sketch 4, it creates a circle, in this case 10 millimeters. Let's go ahead and make it bigger, 25, and it sweeps it along that path. And of course, we have some options. We can do things like make it a thin feature, which essentially makes a tube that follows this path. So it's a quick and easy way for us to simply just draw a path and use this functionality in order for us to make a tube or a pipe or some sort of complex sweep with a round profile. Now, if you don't want to sweep a circular profile, you can go back to your sketch profile and you can use all the information that you create in your own sketches. For instance, in this case, we're going to keep sketch 4, which is our path, and for our profile, we're going to select this bottom sketch, sketch 1. And what it does is it takes sketch 1 and it tries to sweep it along that path. Now, if we look at the preview, you can see some things kind of go haywire up top. That's because we still have thin features selected. So let's deselect that and have it just make a solid, and that might give us a little bit better idea of what's going on. So it's taking this large oval or ellipse profile and it's trying to take it along this path. And obviously things are not going well for this. But as we look in here, we have a guide curves option. Now we can actually select curves as long as they intersect the profile that can help determine the shape of this. For instance, let's go ahead and select this edge and see what happens. Now you notice nothing is happening. Now when you're using guide curves, in this case, sketch 5 and sketch 6 both have two entities in it. In order to use just one of those, we'll have to right click and use the selection manager. Now when you see this pop up, you have a few options. By default, it should be on select group, but you also have an open loop, a closed loop, region, and then you have a standard selection option. I would leave it on select group and select one of the entities that you want and say OK. Now you'll notice in this case it's actually failing. Let's right click, go to selection manager again, and grab this side and say OK. Once we select both sides, now that it's symmetric, it's able to finish that sweep off. But what's actually happening is it's pretty much neglecting the centerline path. It really has not much to do with this. But that's okay. It really depends on the shape that you're trying to get. Now, as I mentioned, you need to be very aware of the profiles and the guide curves that you're creating in order to create these complex shapes. Now, let's say that we wanted to take this base shape through the smaller circle and up to this slot shape up top. Well, we can't really use sweep for that because essentially sweep is taking one profile and some guide curves or a centerline path, and it's taking that shape and it's trying to manipulate it to go along those paths. Well, if we want to make solid geometry that goes between these, we need to use either a loft or a boundary. Let's take a look at the difference between the two. When you're creating a loft, you need to have profiles, and this is going to be at least a starting profile and an ending profile. Unlike sweep, when we did sweep, we had to have a starting profile and a path. So in this case, we're going to select this bottom shape, and we're going to go ahead and select this top shape. So you can see instantly what's happening is it's taking it from this ellipse up to this slot shape. But if you look at it, there are green dots on here. And these green dots are actually indicating an area of twist. You want to do your best to line these up. While when you're using the loft command, it has to snap to points, start or end points of sketch entities. So the sketch entity on the top actually has two straight lines and two arcs. Well, that means that it has 4 different places it can snap to. The bottom, even though it has some control points on it, this is actually one single sketch entity and it has nowhere to snap to. So what this means is you can accidentally induce some twist in your shape when you don't really mean to. And there's no really good way for us to control this. Now, if you're trying to make this shape and you were trying to use a loft, typically what you would do is sketch half of the entity. So you would draw a straight line between everything and trim it. That way you have a start point and an end point, and you can use your guide curves along those. But let's go ahead and move on with this example and see what else we can do with it. So inside here, we have our profiles. If we want to add a third profile, we simply go and select it, and we need to make sure that we order it appropriately. So we can move sketch 2 up in the chain, and again, make sure that that green point is located somewhere that will actually allow us to create this shape. And again, this is a big problem when you're using the loft feature. It doesn't have a great way for you to control this. These points are sort of free to move around. Sometimes they get locked to geometry. And oftentimes you end up creating something that is less than ideal for your geometry. So let's go ahead and select sketch 2 and delete it. And let's take a look at some of our other options. In here, we also have guide curves. You can select a start and an end guide curve. Now this guide curve, again, has to intersect your profiles. So in this case, I'm going to select both sketch entities from sketch 5 and both from sketch 6. And you notice that this does a great job of controlling the shape, but it is a little bit different on the back and the front, and that's because we have a slight amount of twist here. And again, you can move these points around and you can get to a section where it's not actually creating this. Now SOLIDWORKS is doing its best to take this surface through all of the guide curves we created. But we do need to be aware that it is taking some liberties. Guide curve influence type. Now, by default, it's set to to next guide, but you also have to next sharp, to next edge, and global. Now, these options are a bit more advanced, but I just want to mention that this dropdown is here. There's also an open dropdown. Now, open, we have set to normal to profile or direction vector. So we do have a little bit more control over how it enters and exits each of these profiles. But you should note that you will have to manually select all of them and change them individually. So now we're controlling it to be normal to each of these as it goes in and out. We also have some control over the start and end constraints. Now, this is universal. Start is going to be from sketch 1 and end is going to be from sketch 3. So this means if you have more than 2 profiles, you're only able to really control those. So we're going to say normal to profile for the start, and we're going to say normal to profile for the end. Now this matches the curvature that is in these sketches, so everything works out fine. But what it does is it helps control the curvature in the area where we're not touching one of those sketches. So as we go around, it's helping control it in this area. But again, we still have that issue with the twist because we are trying to create this thing with an ellipse on the bottom that doesn't have a sketch point or a start and end point. We really don't have a great way to ensure that this is the exact shape we want. So let's go ahead and exit out of this and let's try the last option, and that's boundary. Now boundary looks a little bit different because it doesn't have profiles and paths or profiles and guide curves. It essentially has a direction 1 and a direction 2. Now it's the same exact thing. You can consider direction 1 as your profiles and direction 2 as your guides, but this allows us some flexibility. Spline had to have a single profile and paths or guide curves. Loft had to have at least a start and an end profile, didn't have to have guide curves, but you could add them in there. Boundary can go from a start and an end, or if we clear this, it can go from a start and it can use guide curves, or we can have any number of variations inside here. So we can use all 4 guide curves, we can use a start and an end profile, and we can also toss in this intermediate profile. Now inside of a boundary, we don't really have to reorder these. You can see that we don't really have to move them up and down. So everything sort of works out. It knows what shape it's trying to take in. And one other important thing inside of the boundary operation is these points no longer have to be fixed to intersection entities. So we can drag this over to the edge and get them all pretty close. Now, in reality, again, what you would really want to do is only draw half of this, or even a quarter of it. Because it is symmetric in all directions, we could simply focus on just a quarter of this sketch and this features. Now, with these operations, you see these purple boxes and the blue boxes are sort of floating all over the place. These are going to be the influence, what's happening as the curvature of the surfaces enter and exit. So you'll notice that in direction 1, we can do normal to profile. And again, we do this for all of them. Notice it puts normal after each one of these. Now, you'll notice that when we get to sketch 2, it gives us an error. It tells us that the guide curve does not match that. And so basically what it's telling us is that the curves, as it enters and exits this direction 1 influence curve, it's not going to be completely normal to the profile. where at the top and the bottom, we have a relation that's setting those equal to normal, but in the middle, we don't. So we aren't really able to apply that influence. It lets us, but it doesn't really work. Now with these curves, we can do normal to profile. We can go ahead and do that for all of them. And now we can mask select multiples, but you notice that it grays this box out. So it's unfortunately an operation that has to be done to each of them. But you will notice that these boxes on the screen allow you to do it as well. And that sometimes helps look at exactly which curve you're dealing with. But when you have an object like this that's completely revolved, full 3D, it sometimes gets a little confusing with these boxes. So I like to focus on the property window over here. Another thing we have in this operation is this tangency influence slider. Now we can drag this up and down, and it essentially controls the weight of the handles just like in a spline as it enters and exits these curves. We'll get into the functionality of dealing with these curves and actually setting them up when we talk about our example. But for now, just understand the differences between sweep, loft, and boundary, what you have to define in order to get those, and really understanding what your output's going to be. So this is a really nice, soft, rounded, blended surface, and we had to do a lot of sketches in order to define that, but we created a really nice surface. Now we could shell this thing, we could work with it, do whatever we want, and move forward with complex design.